If you have any comics published between 1954 and 2011, there's a chance it has this symbol on it. This symbol is known as the seal of approval, and as it says, this comic was approved by the Comics Code Authority. Let's go back and find out what this really means and why it was created, along with discussing the absurdity of its rules. The 40s are known as the golden age of comics, and for good reason. Superhero comics, what most people think of today when hearing the term comic book, were at the height of their popularity. The citizens of the United States turned to these colorful stories of good triumphing over evil in the midst of a world war. Their patriotic themes are a reflection of most Americans' attitudes at the time. With the end of the war came a rise in different comic genres, however: horror and crime. Many groups and organizations disapproved of these new comics, but none would cause as much of a stir as a book published by a child psychologist. It's 1954, a year of great change in the United States. The ruling of Brown versus the Board of Education declares segregation in schools as unconstitutional. The Radio Corporation of America debuts the CT-100, the first mass-produced color TV, and Richard Herrick has the first successful kidney transplant. Another thing that came out this year was Frederick Wertham's book, Seduction of the Innocent. Released on April 19th, Wertham claims to have found a link between juvenile delinquency and comic book readership. Here is one of Wertham's easily debunked claims from his book. The general statement has been made that comic books might be helpful for children who will not read anything else. That is certainly pedagogically unsound. Of course, there are children who have been corrupted by comic books so that they do not want to read anything else, to the detriment of their ability to acquire proper reading habits. But is it sound to advise that addiction to comic book reading be cured by addiction to comic book reading? Basically, what Wertham is saying here is that reading comics will lead children to swear off other types of reading and become addicted to the medium. Despite the fallacy in this argument and other dubious statements made by Wertham, such as implying a homosexual relationship between Batman and his young ward Robin, Wertham's book caused an uproar in the United States. Many children have difficulties in general when learning to read or have issues moving away from picture to chapter books, and comic books are a great segue into more complex stories. I also see nothing wrong with comics being a child's favorite or preferred way to read because they are still wanting and willing to read. And I'm not alone in this belief. In their book, Teaching Visual Literacy, Using Comic Books, Graphic Novels, Anime, Cartoons, and More to Develop Comprehension and Thinking Skills, Nancy Frey and Douglas Fisher write, "What energizes such investigation and helps students become lifelong readers is their interest in the material being studied. I have noticed that students are captivated by this form, and no doubt a key reason lies in our students' attraction to the subversive. A comic book in English class? Hardcore!" This reaction, in part, prompts some interesting and valuable behavior. When presented with comic books in a classroom setting, my students often read ahead, and more importantly, reread the individual works. It would be difficult to overestimate the importance of these two acts, for they are a clear demonstration not only of student engagement with books, but they also reflect students' acknowledgement that stories are worth revisiting and studying. In an age when getting students to complete the assigned reading is like pushing water uphill, it is energizing to witness them taking the initiative to do extra reading. Frederick Wertham's book led to a number of Senate hearings on April 21st, 22nd, and June 4th of 1954. Not wanting the government to interfere in the comic book industry, a number of comic publishers banded together to form the Comics Magazine Association of America in October of the same year. This organization created a set of regulations known as the Comics Code, restricting what was allowed to be shown in comics. Like I said before, the outrage in comics mostly came from horror and crime comics, so these two were hit hardest. In Part A of the original Comics Code, Rules 11 and 12 state, "The letters of the word crime on a comics magazine cover shall never be appreciably greater in dimension than the other words contained in the title. The word crime shall never appear alone on a cover, and restraint in the use of the word crime in titles or subtitles shall be exercised." While the first rule in Part B is, "No comic magazine shall use the word horror or terror in its title." Rule 5 from the same section states, "Scenes dealing with or instruments associated with Walking Dead, torture, vampires and vampirism, ghouls, cannibalism, and werewolfism are prohibited." Other rules included not showing deformities, and good having to always triumph over evil in the end. With all these rules and regulations, comics were now looked down on even more as a form of children's entertainment. Many large publishing companies at the time, Archie, Marvel, DC, etc., immediately got on board with the code, and for good reason, as many wholesale places where comics were sold refused to buy any comic which did not have the seal of approval displayed on the front cover. Some publishers refused to submit their comics for approval or found loopholes. Dell Comics, which published comics for children, including licensed characters from Disney and other companies, decided to opt out of the code, confident that their trusted image would guarantee their success without an outside regulatory board. Mad switched their format with issue 24, changing from a comic to a magazine, which meant they had no reason to follow the code. Despite these rules and regulations, it seems some people would try to abuse the seal. As written in the fanzine Newfangles number 44 by Don and Maggie Thompson, the first, and until now, only time was in 1955 when William M. Gaines of EC, an incredible science fiction number 33, as a substitute for a code-disapproved story, a story called Judgment Day, which had appeared in Weird Fantasy number 18 in 1953. The code said no on Judgment Day 2. They objected to the central character being black. The story is a strong allegory on the evils of race prejudice, and the point is nullified if the lead character is white. Gaines told the code authority that he was going to print the story, and if they did not give the issue the code seal, he would see that the world found out why. The code personnel nervously withdrew. The issue appeared with the seal. Within the code, under the heading Religion, there is one rule which states, ridicule or attack on any religious or racial group is never permissible. The hypocrisy here cannot be overstated. The code claims to dislike racism and discourage racism, but when presented with a story about a black character, they try to shut it down and only relent at the threat of being exposed. This makes me wonder how many of the comics disapproved by the CCA were truly considered to be against the code, and how many were attempts to marginalize groups. Let's look at another example. While nothing in the code directly calls out LGBTQ+ members, any comic with characters representing the community was rejected. For example, in an interview with John Byrne, he was asked about the character Northstar he had created as a member of Alpha Flight. The interviewer poses the question, was it your intent when you created Northstar that he would be a gay man? And at the end of his response, Byrne says, of course, the temper of the times, the powers that were, and naturally, the comics code would not let me come right out and state that Jean Paul was homosexual, but I managed to get the word out even with those barriers. So I mentioned before that Wortham had suggested Batman and Robin were some kind of gay allegory, and in response to this, DC introduced Batwoman in 1956 as a romantic interest for Batman. Even though Catwoman already existed, the code probably did not like her because she was a criminal. Our next big event in the history of the CCA is almost 20 years later in 1971. In this year, the United States government approached Marvel Comics proposing the publication of a comic with an anti-drug message. Stan Lee wrote a 3-issue arc in Amazing Spider-Man number 96 through 98, showing Harry Osborn, the son of the Green Goblin, was struggling with addiction. The CCA refused to publish the story, as they believed showing drugs, even in this way, was against the spirit of the code. Marvel published the issues anyway, sans code. The CCA did not take kindly to this, but after a promise from Marvel not to publish without the code again, they forgave them. This event was a kick in the butt for the CCA though, and they decided to update the code. It was amended to allow some of the horror elements that had been previously restricted. The 4th paragraph of Part B now reads, scenes dealing with or instruments associated with Walking Dead or torture shall not be used. Vampires, ghouls, and werewolves shall be permitted to be used when handled in the classic tradition, such as Frankenstein, Dracula, and other high-caliber literary works written by Edgar Allan Poe, Saki, Conan Doyle, and other respected authors whose works are read in schools around the world. Right below this, in their new stance on drugs, narcotics or drug addiction shall not be presented except as a vicious habit. DC then published a similar story, a 2-issue arc in which we learn Speedy, Green Arrow's young sidekick, is a heroin addict. This one was printed within the code's guidelines. Throughout the late 70s and early 80s, the big publishers continued to use the code without much issue. In 1984, DC started publishing Swamp Thing without CCA approval with issue 29. Despite publishing this one title without the seal of approval, DC continued to get approval on most of their comics with some exceptions. like Watchmen: The Dark Knight Returns or their entire Vertigo imprint. Feeling the code was outdated and too restrictive, the CCA updated the code once again in 1989, making it into more a series of guidelines that allowed more contextual judgment. With the 80s came something that would shake the world of comics: the explosion of independent publishers. With the decline in comic readership, comics went from being in wholesale stores and moved to specialty stores. In 1983, Mirage Studios published the first issue of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which quickly became a phenomenon. By 1987, the Turtles had their own cartoon, and their toys were hitting store shelves. In 1990, they released the highest-grossing independent film at the time. All this from a comic that never followed the code. Independent publishers continued to grow in popularity in the 90s, especially after the formation of Image Comics, which would introduce us to characters and stories such as Spawn, and in the early 2000s, The Walking Dead and Invincible. Image is now the third largest comic book publisher in the United States. Independent publishers had their work cut out for them, much like me. I have no team behind me. I work independently, researching, scripting, voiceover, editing. That's all me. I love doing these videos, and if you love watching them and have the means, consider checking out my Patreon in the description below. You can both support me and see your name at the end of my videos. Let's get back to the code. In 2001, when the CCA sent X-Force number 116 back to Marvel with the listed changes, Marvel decided they were done. They created their own comic book rating system and now rate their comics in-house. DC and Archie Comics were the only two publishers still following the code by 2011, and when DC decided to follow in Marvel's footsteps and create their own rating system, Archie decided there wasn't any point in being the only one following the code, and with that, the code was dead. What I find ironic about Archie Comics is in 2013, they started publishing Afterlife with Archie, a survival horror comic following Archie and his friends trying to survive a zombie apocalypse. And after the success of this series, Archie eventually created an imprint called Archie Horror. I've always been an Archie fan, having gotten 20 or so digests at a yard sale when I was young. But in my opinion, Archie Horror's offerings are some of the best the company has to offer. Back on the topic though, despite the dissolution of the CCA, its ramifications would never be forgotten. Marvel and DC continued to use the rating systems they established after leaving the code. The many horror and crime comics from before the comics establishment had their runs cut short. Who knows what creative offerings we could have had if these genres had not been targeted. The classic superhero comics were on a decline when the code was established, so we may have seen a new different kind of comic industry had the code not been established. As long as I can remember, I have loved superheroes, and some of my early memories are creating my own comics. So if superheroes weren't the industry standard, I don't know if I would be here today with this YouTube channel, and you definitely wouldn't be here watching it.